Welcome to the Care Clinic Pod. I'm Emma, and this is Jones.
Ever get that feeling like, you're speaking one language and your partner's on a whole other wavelength?
Oh, absolutely.
Like trying to have a serious talk about, I don't know, who does the dishes, and they go off on a tangent about, like, penguins or something. Relationships, am I right?
You're telling me it's like we each come with our own instruction manual, and sometimes those manuals, they don't exactly match up, do they?
And that's where this whole deep dive comes in. We're tackling neurodivergent relationships.
Right, because it's not always smooth sailing.
But, and this is important, it's not about slapping labels on anyone.
Definitely not.
Think of it more like our brains are all wired a little differently, and that affects everything, how we experience the world, how we communicate, you name it.
And the sources we looked at, they really emphasize that spectrum idea,
Yeah, the spectrum.
Like neurodiversity isn't one size fits all. It's not a checklist. It's more about recognizing those different ways of being.
Which I love, because it means there's no normal to try to squeeze ourselves into.
Exactly. And speaking of fitting in, one of the big things that came up was communication, or sometimes the lack of it. Misunderstandings. They happen in every relationship, right?
Oh, tell me about it.
But in neurodivergent relationships, our sources suggest these misunderstandings can be, well, more common.
Okay, so that's reassuring, but it's not like a deal breaker, right?
Not at all, but it does mean we need to be extra mindful. Like imagine someone with ADHD, their brain might be going a mile a minute.
Right, bouncing all over the place.
While someone with autism might be super focused on the details, taking everything literally.
So it's like they're speaking different dialects, even if it's all technically English.
And that's where recognizing those patterns can be huge. Instead of getting frustrated, you can start to see, okay, this is how your brain works. This is how mine works. How do we bridge that gap?
Which, easier said than done, right? So how do we actually bridge that gap when it comes to communication?
Our sources had some interesting ideas. Visual aids, for one.
Visual aids.
Yeah, like for some people, seeing things laid out literally, like with diagrams, lists, even just mind maps, it can make all the difference.
It's like giving your thoughts subtitles.
Exactly. And that reminded me, Care Clinic has that journaling feature.
Yeah.
I was thinking for couples who maybe struggle with face-to-face talks, having that shared space to write things down could be a game changer.
It's like hitting the pause button on the argument before it even starts.
Exactly.
Because sometimes you just need a minute to process before you respond,
No, for sure. Especially when it comes to like sensory overload and stuff.
Oh, sensory overload, yeah. That was another big one in the research. Like, we've all been to that concert that's just too loud or stuck in a crowded room.
Right. You just want to escape.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But imagine feeling that way all the time.
Yeah, that's the reality for a lot of neurodivergent folks. The sources talked about how things like bright lights, loud noises, even certain textures.
Or smells.
Yes. Things most people wouldn't think twice about can be really overwhelming.
Like, that sensory dial is cranked up to 11 with no off switch.
And it's not about being difficult. It's a real thing, and it can lead to anxiety, meltdowns. It's important to take it seriously.
So how do you deal with that as a couple?
Yeah.
Short of living in a padded room, I mean.
Communication, again, is key. The sources really emphasize that. People need to be able to say, hey, this is what I need. This is what my limit is.
Instead of just toughing it out and hoping for the best.
Right. Like, hey, loud restaurant, not my jam. Can we maybe sit outside?
Or I need a 5-minute break from life right now.
Exactly. And it's not always about reacting in the moment either. Some proactive stuff can help too.
Like?
Noise-canceling headphones, those are a godsend for some people. Creating calming spaces at home. Even just having a signal like a word or a gesture when someone needs a sensory timeout.
It's all about that understanding, knowing your partner's needs.
Yeah, and it can actually be a bonding experience, figuring this stuff out together.
That's a good point. It's not all doom and gloom.
Not at all. When you learn to navigate those differences, it can actually bring you closer. You're building trust. You're showing empathy.
Which, let's be honest, every relationship needs that.
Yes.
Okay, but speaking of things every relationship needs, our sources also talked about money.
Finances. Always a fun topic.
Right. But avoiding it never helps. And what they pointed out was, just like with communication or sensory stuff, understanding how neurodiversity plays into your money habits, that can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. Now, it's not like every neurodivergent person struggles with money. Of course not. But some might have differences in how their executive function works, right?
So it's like some brains are wired for spreadsheets and some are, well, not so much.
And that can cause friction, right?
Yeah.
But that's where the whole teamwork thing comes in. Our sources said, just like any couple, you got to figure out each other's strengths,
Yeah.
what each person brings to the table.
Instead of it being like one person's the responsible one and the other's always in trouble.
Exactly. It's about making a plan together that works for both of you. And you know what could help with that?
What's that?
Care Clinic. That budgeting feature they've got, that's pretty slick.
Oh, right.
Like, you can track your spending, set goals, it's all right there.
It's like having a financial therapist, but way less judgmental.
Totally. Okay, but shifting gears a bit, because our sources also talked about something else that impacts relationships, and that's mental health.
Right, because it's all connected, isn't it? It's not just about how our brains work, but our, emotional landscape, too.
Absolutely. And the research showed a lot of neurodivergent folks, they deal with anxiety, depression. It's really common.
Which makes sense. The world can be an overwhelming place.
Totally.
Yeah.
But the thing is, when you add those mental health challenges on top of everything else, it can make relationships even more complex.
It's like an extra layer of, I don't know, a layer of something.
Right. Like, imagine trying to communicate effectively when you're also dealing with anxiety, or trying to be intimate when you're feeling depressed. It's tough.
And sometimes those issues, they don't get talked about,
Exactly. Our sources said that happens a lot. People might feel ashamed or scared to bring it up.
Like there's still this stigma around mental health, even though it's just as important as physical health.
Exactly. So what they emphasized was being open with each other, creating that space where it's safe to say, hey, I'm struggling, and then finding support, whether that's therapy, medication, whatever works.
Because you're a team. Right. That's the whole point of a relationship.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of teamwork, we gotta talk about the future, because those big life decisions, they come up for everyone.
Oh, yeah. The whole marriage, kids, where we live in, all that fun stuff.
Right. And for some neurodivergent folks, that long-term planning, it might feel different.
Like anxiety inducing, maybe?
For some people, yeah. So it's not about avoiding those conversations, but maybe approaching them a little differently.
Being extra sensitive.
Exactly. And our sources suggested maybe breaking those big decisions down into smaller steps so it's not so overwhelming.
Instead of just dropping, let's move to Fiji out of the blue.
Right. And again, Care Clinic can be helpful for this kind of stuff, Mapping out those goals, tracking progress, they can make it feel less daunting.
It's like you're in it together every step of the way.
Exactly. And, as we wrap this up, I think the big takeaway is there's no one way to do relationships, neurodivergent or not.
Totally. What works for your best friend might not work for you, and that's fine.
Right. It's about finding your own groove, communicating your needs, and remembering those differences we've been talking about. They can actually be strengths.
Yeah, they make your relationship stronger, more interesting even.
Exactly. So as we leave you today, here's something to think about. What's one tiny thing you can do today to understand your partner a little better?
It doesn't have to be huge, even just, I don't know, asking a question instead of assuming.
Exactly. Every little bit helps. And hey, if you want a tool to help you navigate it all, check out Care Clinic. It's not just for health stuff, it's for building those healthy relationships too.
Until next time, keep on diving deep, everyone.